The Germans thought they understood war, but they were completely blind to the invisible web connecting us, the real secret weapon that turned the tide. The year was 1944, and the forests of Europe were about to witness one of the most extraordinary military secrets of World War II. While German commanders believed they understood every aspect of American tank warfare, they remained completely blind to a revolutionary communication system that was unfolding right before their eyes. American Sherman tanks weren't just rolling through the French countryside as individual metal beasts. They were operating as a single, unified organism, sharing live tactical orders in real time through a technology so advanced that even when German intelligence captured American tanks, they failed to grasp the true significance of what they had found. This is the untold story of how American ingenuity created a battlefield advantage so profound that it would help turn the tide of the war. All while the enemy never fully comprehended what was happening. The innovation wasn't just about better radios or clearer signals. It was about transforming the very nature of armored warfare itself, creating a new doctrine that would echo through military strategy for generations to come. What the German troops saw were American tanks that seemed to move with an almost supernatural coordination, responding to threats with uncanny speed and precision. What they didn't see was the invisible web of communication that connected every tank commander, every crew member, and every tactical decision into one seamless battle network. The story begins not on the battlefields of France or the plains of Germany, but in the dusty training grounds of Fort Knox, Kentucky, where American military strategists were wrestling with a fundamental problem that had plagued armored warfare since tanks first rumbled onto the battlefields of World War I. Problem was simple to understand, but fiendishly difficult to solve. How do you make dozens of massive, loud, slow-moving steel boxes work together as a coordinated fighting force when the very nature of tank combat seemed designed to isolate each crew in their own private hell of noise, smoke, and chaos? Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Harman had spent countless hours observing tank exercises in the late 1930s, and what he saw troubled him deeply. American tank crews were brave, well-trained, and equipped with increasingly capable machines, but they fought like medieval knights, each tank essentially operating as its own independent unit. When a tank platoon went into action, the commander of each tank could communicate with his own crew through the intercom system, but communicating with other tanks meant opening the hatch, exposing yourself to enemy fire, and trying to use hand signals or flags while bullets and shells flew through the air around you. It was primitive, dangerous, and worst of all, it was slow. By the time a tank commander could signal a new order to his platoon, the tactical situation had often changed completely. The Germans had recognized this problem early and had equipped their panzers with radio systems, but even their solution was limited. German tank radios in the early war years were generally restricted to communication between platoon leaders and company commanders, with individual tank crews still relying on visual signals for most tactical coordination. The German approach created a top-down command structure where orders flowed from above, but lateral communication between tanks in the same platoon remained limited. American observers studying German tactics in the Spanish Civil War and the early campaigns of World War II recognized both the advantages and the limitations of this system. The United States Army, with its tradition of decentralized decision-making and junior officer initiative, wanted something different, something more flexible, something that would allow not just commanders to issue orders, but would enable every tank in a formation to share information about threats, opportunities, and tactical developments as they happened. The technical challenges were enormous. Radio technology in the late 1930s was bulky, unreliable, and power-hungry. The radios available at the time were designed for stationary use or for vehicles that could dedicate significant space and electrical generating capacity to communication equipment. Tanks, already cramped spaces filled with ammunition, fuel, engines, and crew members, had little room for additional equipment. Moreover, the electrical interference generated by a tank's engine and the thick armor that protected the crew also blocked radio signals, making reliable communication even more difficult. Early experiments with tank-mounted radios in the American Army were disappointing. The radios were temperamental, often failing at critical moments. The range was limited, sometimes only a few hundred yards. The audio quality was poor, with static and engine noise often drowning out transmitted messages. Voice communication was frequently unintelligible, forcing crews to rely on Morse code, which required specially trained radio operators and was far too slow for the rapidly changing dynamics of tank combat. But a small group of engineers and military planners refused to accept these limitations. They believed that if the technical problems could be solved, radio-equipped tanks could revolutionize armored warfare. The leader of this group was Major General Abner Chaffee, who would later be called the father of the American armored force. Chaffee had an almost prophetic vision of what tanks could become. He didn't see them as merely mobile artillery or infantry support weapons, which was how many conservative military thinkers viewed them. Instead, he envisioned tanks as the cavalry of the modern age, capable of rapid movement, independent operation, and most importantly, coordinated action on a scale never before possible. Chaffee understood that the key to this vision was communication. In 1939, he began pushing for a crash program to develop a radio system specifically designed for tank warfare. The project landed on the desk of a young engineer named Paul Galvin, whose company, Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, would later become famous under a different name, Motorola. Galvin had made his reputation developing car radios, which might seem like a far cry from military communications, but the problems were surprisingly similar. Both applications required radios that could operate in vehicles, handle electrical interference from engines, survive vibration and rough handling, and work reliably with the limited electrical power available from a vehicle's battery and generator. Galvin assembled a team of engineers and gave them an ambitious set of requirements. The radio system had to be small enough to fit into the already cramped interior of a tank. It had to be rugged enough to survive the incredible vibration and shock of cross-country tank movement in combat. It had to be simple enough that tank crews, who were already learning to operate incredibly complex machines, could use it without extensive training. It had to provide clear voice communication over distances of several miles. And critically, it had to be reliable, working consistently in all weather conditions and all tactical situations. The engineering team worked with an urgency, driven by the knowledge that war was coming. In Europe, Hitler's Germany was already on the march. Poland had fallen in a matter of weeks to a new form of warfare the world was calling blitzkrieg, lightning war. And at the heart of that lightning were German Panzer divisions using radio communication to coordinate their attacks. The American team knew they were in a race, not just to match German capabilities, but to exceed them. The breakthrough came in 1940 with the development of the SCR 508 radio, set for tanks, and the SCR 510 for armored cars. These radios represented a quantum leap in mobile military communications. They used frequency modulation, which was far more resistant to interference than the amplitude modulation used in earlier radios. They had a range of up to 20 miles under good conditions, though practical combat ranges were usually 3 to 5 miles. Most importantly, they provided clear voice communication that allowed tank commanders to talk to each other almost as easily as if they were standing face to face. But the radios themselves were only part of the innovation. The real revolution came in how the American army decided to deploy them. While other armies, including the German Wehrmacht, installed radios primarily in command tanks, the United States made the radical decision to equip every single tank with a radio capable of transmitting and receiving on the same frequencies. This meant that every tank commander in a platoon could hear every other tank commander, could share information instantly, could coordinate movements without waiting for orders to trickle down through a command hierarchy. It was a technological expression of the American military's cultural preference for initiative and decentralized decision-making. A tank platoon equipped with these radios didn't have to wait for the platoon leader to assess a situation and issue orders. If a tank on the flank spotted an enemy position, that information was instantly available to every other tank in the formation. If a tank found a weak point in enemy defenses, other tanks could immediately exploit it. If a tank was hit and disabled, other tanks knew about it instantly and could adjust their positions accordingly. The system required the development of new tactical procedures and new ways of thinking about armored combat. Tank crews had to learn radio discipline, understanding when to transmit and when to maintain radio silence. They had to master concise communication techniques, conveying essential tactical information in just a few words. They developed a whole vocabulary of code words and standard phrases that allowed them to communicate complex Tactical concepts quickly and clearly. Commands like moving to contact, enemy armor front, suppressing fire, and withdrawal by bounds became part of a shared language that every tank crew member understood. The training program for this new system was intensive. At Fort Knox and other training centers, tank crews spent hundreds of hours practicing radio communication, learning to talk to each other while simultaneously operating their tanks, identifying targets, loading and firing weapons, and navigating across rough terrain. They practiced until communication became instinctive, until a tank commander could spot a threat, transmit its location, and have his entire platoon respond in a coordinated manner in just seconds. The first units to receive the new radio-equipped tanks were skeptical. Old-school tankers, many of whom had served in World War I or had trained in the tradition of that conflict, thought the radios were an unnecessary complication. They worried that the radios would distract crews from their primary mission of fighting the tank. They feared that radio communication would slow down decision-making, creating a situation where tank commanders would wait for orders instead of acting on their own initiative. Some even worried that the radios would make American tactics too predictable, that enemies would simply listen to American radio transmissions and use that information to ambush American tanks. These concerns were taken seriously, and the Army conducted extensive war games and exercises to test the new system. What they found surprised even the advocates of the radio-equipped tank concept. Far from slowing down decision-making, the radios actually accelerated it. Far from reducing initiative, they enhanced it by giving every tank commander a clearer picture of the tactical situation. And far from making American tactics predictable, they made them more flexible and adaptive. In a critical exercise conducted in Louisiana in 1941, two tank battalions faced off against each other. One battalion was equipped with the new radio systems, with every tank able to communicate with every other tank. The other battalion used traditional communication methods, relying on visual signals and messenger vehicles to relay orders. The exercise was supposed to last 3 days, but it was called off after less than 24 hours because the radio-equipped battalion had achieved such overwhelming dominance that continuing the exercise was pointless. The radio-equipped tanks had moved faster, concentrated their fire more effectively, responded to threats more quickly, and exploited opportunities more aggressively than their opponents. The commanders of the battalion without radios reported feeling like they were fighting in slow motion, always reacting to situations that had already changed by the time they received information about them. This exercise convinced even the skeptics. The United States Army committed to equipping every tank in its inventory with radio communication equipment, a decision that would require enormous resources and industrial capacity, but would pay dividends on every battlefield where American tanks fought. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the foundation was laid for a revolution in armored warfare. American tank crews were training with radio systems that would give them capabilities their enemies couldn't match. But the technology was only part of the story. The real innovation was in the tactical doctrine that American commanders were developing to exploit these capabilities. They were creating a new way of fighting, a new approach to armored combat that would transform individual tanks into something greater than the sum of their parts. The German military intelligence services, the Abwehr, knew that American tanks had radios. They had captured equipment specifications. They had interrogated prisoners. They even had photographs of American tanks showing the distinctive radio antennas. But knowing that American tanks had radios and understanding how those radios fundamentally changed the nature of tank combat were two entirely different things. The Germans, shaped by their own military culture of centralized command and their own tactical experiences, assumed that American radios served the same purpose as German radios, to allow commanders to issue orders to subordinates. They never grasped that the American system was designed to create a web of lateral communication that transformed how information flowed through an armored formation. This misunderstanding would prove costly, as American tanks began arriving in North Africa in late 1942. They brought with them not just superior numbers and industrial capacity, but a fundamentally different approach to armored warfare. The Germans were about to encounter an enemy that could see the battlefield more clearly, respond to threats more quickly, and coordinate actions more effectively than any opponent they had faced before. The invisible web of radio communication that connected every American tank was about to prove its worth in the harsh deserts of North Africa. and later in the hedgerows of France and the forests of Germany. The war was about to change, and the German troops who would face these radio-equipped American tanks would find themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to coordinate their actions. They would never fully understand why American tanks seemed to move with such uncanny precision, why they responded to threats so quickly, why they exploited weaknesses so aggressively. The secret was in the radios, and more importantly, in the revolutionary tactical doctrine that those radios enabled. The story of how this system developed, how it was used in combat, and how it changed the course of the war is a story that has never been fully told until now. Asterisk, if you are enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Asterisk, the first American tanks to face German forces in World War II rolled into combat in North Africa in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. The crews of these tanks, mostly young men who had never seen combat, were about to test their training and their revolutionary communication systems against the most experienced tank forces in the world. The German Afrika Corps, led by the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been fighting in the desert for nearly 2 years and had earned a fearsome reputation. German tank crews were veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. They knew their equipment intimately. They had perfected their tactics through hard experience, and they had complete confidence in their ability to defeat any opponent. When they first encountered American tanks, they expected an easy victory. Asterisk, the initial encounters seemed to confirm German expectations. American crews, still learning the brutal realities of combat, made mistakes that cost them dearly. The M3 Lee and M4 Sherman tanks that equipped American units were in many ways inferior to the German Panzer IV and the feared Tiger tanks. American tank armor was thinner, their guns were less powerful, and their crews were inexperienced. In the first battles at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces inflicted heavy losses on American tank units, destroying dozens of American tanks and sending American forces into a hasty retreat. German tank commanders sent confident reports back to their headquarters, assuring their superiors that American tanks posed no serious threat. But buried in those same reports were small details that should have alarmed German intelligence analysts. German tank commanders noted that American tanks seemed to respond to threats unusually quickly. They observed that when one American tank spotted a German position, other American tanks in the formation would immediately adjust their positions even before any visible signals were exchanged. They reported that American tanks seemed to coordinate their fire in ways that suggested a level of communication that German commanders found puzzling. Asterisk. One German tank commander, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, wrote in his after-action report about an engagement near Sidi-Bou Zid where his platoon of Panzer IVs had ambushed an American tank platoon. Weber's tanks had achieved complete surprise, firing from concealed positions and destroying the lead American tank with their first shots. Weber expected the remaining American tanks to scatter in confusion, which was the typical response of inexperienced crews facing a sudden ambush. Instead, the American tanks immediately began executing what appeared to be a rehearsed response. While one tank laid down suppressing fire on Weber's position, 2 other tanks moved rapidly to flank his position, and a 4th tank pulled back to a hull-down position where it could cover the movement of the flanking tanks. The coordination was so quick and so precise that Weber initially assumed he was facing a British tank unit, as British tanks also had extensive radio equipment. Only later, when he examined the wrecks of destroyed American tanks, did he confirm they were American M4 Shermans. Weber noted in his report that the American response suggested excellent training and good leadership, but he attributed their coordination to visual signals and pre-planned tactics, rather than understanding the role that radio communication played in enabling their response. This pattern repeated itself across the North African theater. American tank units were losing battles, suffering heavy casualties, and learning painful lessons about the realities of armored combat. But even in defeat, they were demonstrating a capacity for coordination and rapid response that puzzled German observers. The key moment came during the Battle of El Ghetto in March 1943. American forces, now under the more aggressive leadership of General George Patton, were pushing eastward against German defensive positions. A company of German tanks, supported by anti-tank guns and infantry, had established a strong defensive position in broken terrain that channeled American tanks into kill zones where German gunners could engage them at point-blank range. Previous American attacks against this position had been repulsed with heavy losses. The standard German tactic was to allow American tanks to advance into the kill zone, destroy the lead tanks to block the advance of following tanks, and then systematically destroy the trapped American formation. But on this particular morning, the American attack developed differently. As the lead American tanks approached the German position, the tank commander spotted the defensive position and immediately transmitted its location to the rest of his company. Within seconds, every tank commander in the company knew exactly where the German tanks were positioned, where the anti-tank guns were dug in, and where the infantry support was located. Instead of continuing forward into the trap, the American company commander immediately ordered a coordinated response. One platoon laid down suppressing fire on the German position, forcing German crews to button up their tanks and take cover. A second platoon moved rapidly to the right, using terrain features for cover, seeking to flank the German position. A third platoon held back in overwatch positions, ready to support whichever element made contact with the enemy. The entire maneuver was executed in less than 3 minutes, faster than German commanders thought possible. The coordination was so smooth that German observers initially believed they were facing a much larger American force that had pre-positioned units to execute a complex encirclement. The German position, strong against a frontal assault, was vulnerable to the kind of rapid multi-directional attack the Americans had just launched. Within minutes, American tanks were firing into the flanks of German positions from multiple directions simultaneously. German crews, trained to expect attacks to develop slowly enough for commanders to assess the situation and reposition forces, found themselves under fire from unexpected directions before they could respond. The German defensive position collapsed, with multiple tanks destroyed and the surviving vehicles forced to withdraw in disorder. German after-action reports from this engagement noted the unusual speed of the American response but still failed to grasp the significance of the radio communication that had enabled it. German analysts attributed the American success to better reconnaissance, more aggressive leadership, or possibly to intelligence information that had revealed the German positions in advance. The idea that every American tank could communicate instantly with every other American tank, creating a level of tactical flexibility that German doctrine didn't contemplate, simply didn't occur to them. As the North African campaign progressed, American tank crews were learning and adapting at a remarkable pace. The initial defeats at Kasserine Pass had been brutal teachers, but the survivors of those early battles were now combat veterans themselves. More importantly, they were learning how to fully exploit their communication systems. Tank commanders were developing an intuitive understanding of how to use their radios to coordinate attacks, share intelligence, and respond to threats. They were creating an oral culture of tank combat, where information flowed constantly between tanks, where every crew member with eyes on the battlefield was contributing to a shared understanding of the tactical situation. The development of effective radio communication techniques in combat conditions went far beyond what had been taught in training. Tank crews discovered that the formal communication procedures they'd learned at Fort Knox were often too slow and cumbersome for the rapid pace of combat. They began developing their own shorthand, their own ways of conveying complex tactical information quickly and clearly. A tank commander who spotted enemy armor might simply say, "Tigers at 2 o'clock, 500 yards, hold down," conveying, in just a few words, the type of threat, its direction relative to his own tank's orientation, its approximate distance, and its tactical posture. Other tank commanders hearing this transmission immediately knew exactly what they were facing and where to look for the threat. This kind of rapid, precise communication gave American tank formations a shared tactical awareness that was unprecedented. In armored warfare, every tank commander heard what every other tank commander reported, creating a collective picture of the battlefield that was far more complete and far more current than what any individual crew could observe from their limited vantage point inside a tank. German tank commanders, in contrast, typically only received information from their platoon or company commanders, creating a more hierarchical and slower information flow. A German tank commander spotting a threat would report it to his platoon leader, who might then report it to the company commander, who would then issue orders based on that information. This chain of communication took time, and in fast-moving tank battles, Time was often the difference between survival and destruction. The American system also created opportunities for JR leaders to exercise initiative in ways that German doctrine discouraged. If an American tank commander spotted an opportunity to exploit a weakness in enemy positions, he could immediately share that information with his peers and his superiors simultaneously. If the company commander approved, or sometimes even if he simply didn't disapprove, tanks could move to exploit that opportunity within seconds. This rapid decision-making cycle gave American tank formations an agility that compensated for many of their tactical disadvantages. Even though American tanks were often outgunned and out-armored by their German opponents, they could maneuver more quickly, concentrate fire more effectively, and respond to changing situations more rapidly. In the chess game of armored combat, the Americans were effectively moving faster than their opponents, sometimes making 2 or 3 moves for every one German move. One of the most significant advantages of the American radio system revealed itself in command and control situations when senior leaders were killed or disabled. In a traditional tank formation, the loss of the company commander or platoon leader could throw an entire unit into confusion as subordinates struggled to understand what had happened and who was now in command. In American tank formations equipped with comprehensive radio systems, the loss of a leader was immediately apparent to everyone in the unit. The next senior commander could assume command instantly, and because all tank commanders had been hearing the same radio traffic and had the same picture of the tactical situation, the transition of command was usually seamless. There were documented instances in North Africa where American tank companies lost their commanders in the first moments of an engagement but continued to fight effectively because every tank commander understood the tactical situation and the company's mission. The Germans, observing these incidents, attributed American resilience to superior training or perhaps to a more flexible command culture, which was partially true. But they missed the technological foundation that made such flexibility possible. German doctrine assumed that tanks without direct leadership from a commander would struggle to maintain cohesion and effectiveness. The German solution was to emphasize rigid adherence to pre-battle plans and to train junior leaders to follow established procedures in the absence of orders. The American solution was to ensure that information flowed so freely that every tank commander could make informed decisions, even in the absence of explicit orders. By the time the North African campaign ended in May 1943, with the surrender of all Axis forces in Tunisia, American tank crews had evolved from inexperienced novices into competent combat veterans. More importantly, they had proven that their radio communication systems provided real combat advantages that could offset material disadvantages. The Germans had captured numerous American tanks during the campaign and had thoroughly examined them. German technical intelligence reports dutifully noted the presence of radio equipment in every American tank. They measured the frequencies, tested the range, and assessed the quality of the equipment. But these technical reports never led to a doctrinal revolution in German thinking about tank communication. German military culture, with its emphasis on centralized command and control, its hierarchical structure, and its trust in the judgment of experienced commanders over technological systems, simply couldn't conceive of the American approach as fundamentally superior. German analysts looked at American radios and saw a technological curiosity, an expensive and somewhat wasteful American tendency to over-engineer solutions to problems that German discipline and training had already solved. They never understood that the Americans weren't trying to solve the same problems the Germans were solving. The Americans were trying to create an entirely different way of fighting, one that treated the tank, platoon, or company not as a collection of individual vehicles following orders, but as a single, unified organism sharing a common nervous system of radio communication. As American forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and then for the long campaign up the Italian peninsula, the lessons learned in North Africa were being disseminated throughout the American armored force. Training programs were updated to reflect combat experience. Radio communication procedures were refined and improved. Tank crews were taught not just how to use their radios, but why radio communication was so critical to their survival and effectiveness. The stage was being set for even more dramatic demonstrations of the power of comprehensive tank communication systems. The Italian campaign would present new challenges, with mountain warfare and close terrain limiting the mobility that had been so important in North Africa. but it would also provide new opportunities to demonstrate how radio-equipped tanks could coordinate complex operations in difficult terrain. And beyond Italy, the greatest test was approaching: the invasion of France and the drive into Germany itself, where American tanks would face the strongest German defenses and the most experienced German tank crews in a campaign that would decide the fate of Europe. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent Italian campaign presented American tank forces with challenges dramatically different from those they had faced in North Africa. The mountainous terrain of Italy, with its narrow valleys, steep hillsides, and countless small towns and villages, was about as far from ideal tank country as could be imagined. Italian roads were often little more than ancient paths carved into mountainsides, too narrow for tanks to pass in opposite directions, winding back and forth in endless switchbacks that made every advance vulnerable to ambush. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, had fortified key positions with a skill and thoroughness that turned every ridgeline, every river crossing, and every mountain pass into a potential killing ground. American tank crews, fresh from the wide open spaces of North Africa, where visibility could extend for miles and maneuver room was nearly unlimited, now found themselves confined to narrow defiles where a single destroyer tank could block an entire column and where German gunners could engage American tanks at point-blank range from concealed positions. These challenging conditions might have seemed to negate the advantages that American radio communication systems provided. After all, what good was the ability to coordinate rapid maneuvers when terrain confined you to a single narrow road? What advantage did shared tactical awareness provide when visibility was limited to a few hundred yards by hills, buildings, and vegetation? But American tank crews and their commanders proved remarkably adept at adapting their tactics and their use of radio communication to these new conditions. In fact, the Italian campaign would see some of the most innovative applications of tank radio systems in the entire war. The key insight that American commanders developed in Italy was that radio communication was even more valuable in close terrain than in open terrain, but it had to be used differently. In the open deserts of North Africa, radios had enabled rapid maneuver and coordination of multi-directional attacks. In the confined spaces of Italian mountain warfare, radios became primarily a tool for maintaining situational awareness and coordinating infantry tank cooperation. American doctrine evolved to emphasize the integration of tanks with infantry in ways that fully exploited radio communication. Tank companies were routinely attached to infantry battalions, and the tank company commander would position himself where he could communicate both with his tanks via radio and with the infantry battalion commander via field telephone or personal contact. When an infantry unit ran into a German point, a process that in earlier wars might have taken hours as messengers carried requests for support back to artillery or tank units, could now happen in minutes. The infantry commander would identify the target to the tank liaison officer, who would immediately radio the information to tank platoons positioned behind the infantry. Tank crews, hearing the description of the target and its location, could begin planning their approach and preparing their ammunition even before receiving formal orders to engage. This rapid integration of infantry observation and tank firepower proved devastatingly effective against German defensive positions. One particularly innovative technique developed during the fighting around Monte Cassino involved the use of tank radios to coordinate indirect fire. Tank guns, designed primarily for direct fire against targets the crew could see, could also be used for indirect fire against targets behind hills or buildings, much like artillery. However, this required a forward observer to spot the target and adjust the tank's fire onto that target. American forces discovered that an infantry officer, equipped with a radio that could communicate with tank frequencies, could serve as a highly mobile forward observer for tank fire. The infantry officer would work his way forward to a position where he could observe a German position that was protected from direct fire by terrain or fortifications. He would then radio the position to the tanks, which would fire over the intervening terrain. The infantry officer would observe where the rounds landed and radio corrections, bringing the tank fire onto the target. This technique, which came to be called tank artillery, gave American forces the ability to bring the hitting power of tank guns to bear on targets that would otherwise have been immune to tank fire. The Germans, observing this technique, recognized it is effective but expensive in terms of ammunition. German doctrine emphasized conservation of ammunition and preferred to wait for direct fire opportunities rather than engaging in what they considered wasteful, indirect fire. What the Germans didn't fully appreciate was that the American technique was only possible because of the comprehensive radio communication that linked forward observers with tank crews. German tanks, which typically only had radios in command, vehicles couldn't have executed this technique even if German doctrine had embraced it. The ability to coordinate fire required that individual tank crews be able to receive targeting information directly from forward observers, something the German communication system simply couldn't support. The Italian campaign also saw the development of sophisticated radio procedures for movement in close terrain. When a tank column was advancing along a narrow mountain road, the lead tank would provide a constant stream of radio reports about what he was seeing, road conditions, possible ambush sites, obstacles, and any signs of enemy presence. Tanks, further back in the column, unable to see what was ahead because of terrain, bends in the road, or the tanks in front of them, could nonetheless maintain a clear picture of what the column was encountering. If the lead tank was hit by enemy fire, the tanks behind immediately knew what had happened and could respond appropriately, often faster than the tank crews could even see the disabled vehicle. This continuous flow of information made tank columns far more difficult to ambush effectively. German commanders, planning ambushes against American tank columns, discovered that even when they achieved surprise and knocked out the lead tank, American forces could respond with coordinated counterfire within seconds. The second tank in the column, hearing the lead tank's report of contact and the sound of the hit, would already be moving to a firing position and alerting following tanks even before the German gunners could shift their fire. German after-action reports from the Italian campaign are filled with references to unexpectedly rapid American responses to ambush days, with some German commanders speculating that the Americans must have had advance intelligence about ambush positions. The simpler explanation, that American tank crews were simply sharing information quickly through their radios, seems to have eluded German analysts. One documented incident from the fighting near Anzio in early 1944 illustrates the power of this system. A platoon of 5 American Sherman tanks was advancing along a road through dense woods when the lead tank was struck by fire from a German Panther tank positioned in a well-concealed position off to the side of the road. The American tank was disabled immediately, its crew bailing out as ammunition inside the tank began to cook off. In a traditional tank column, the remaining tanks would have had to visually identify the threat before responding, a process that it might have taken critical seconds during which the German tank could have destroyed 1 or 2 more American vehicles. But in this case, the commander of the lead tank, even as he was evacuating his burning vehicle, had transmitted a contact report identifying the approximate position of the German tank. The second Sherman in line, hearing this report, had already begun traversing his turret toward the reported position even before he spotted the German tank, and when the German Panther fired at the second Sherman, the American tank was already in the process of acquiring the target and was able to return fire within a second of being shot at. The engagement devolved into a point-blank duel, with both tanks firing as rapidly as they could, load and aim. The American tank was hit twice more, but managed to land 1 solid hit on the Panther that damaged its gun. At this point, the third and fourth tanks in the American column, which had been moving off the road to flank the German position based on the radio reports they had been hearing, came into firing positions and engaged the Panther from its vulnerable side armor. The German tank was destroyed, and the remaining American tanks continued their advance. The entire engagement, from the first shot to the destruction of the German tank, took less than 90 seconds. German battle reports described this action as demonstrating good American training and aggressive tactics, but they attributed the rapid American response to pre-planned procedures rather than recognizing the role of real-time radio communication. German doctrine emphasized the importance of German tanks operating in mutual support, but the German definition of mutual support generally meant tanks positioned where they could see and cover each other. The American system extended mutual support beyond the limits of vision, allowing tanks to coordinate even when they couldn't see each other. The Italian campaign also revealed another significant advantage of comprehensive radio equipment. the ability to rapidly reorganize and regroup scattered forces. Tank combat, especially in close terrain, tended to break up carefully organized formations. Tanks would become separated from their platoons as they maneuvered around obstacles, sought covered positions, or pursued fleeing enemies. In traditional tank forces, reassembling a scattered formation could take considerable time as tank commanders searched for their units or waited at predetermined rally points. In American tank formations, scattered tanks could regroup much more rapidly. A platoon leader could simply broadcast his position over the radio, and tanks could navigate directly to him. A company commander could order scattered elements to concentrate at a specific location, and tanks from different platoons could link up and form ad hoc task forces to accomplish specific missions. This flexibility made American tank formations remarkably resilient. Units that suffered heavy casualties could reorganize on the fly, combining survivors from multiple platoons into effective fighting formations. The Germans observed this American resilience, but generally attributed it to superior American logistics and replacement systems, rather than to the communication systems that made rapid reorganization possible. The evolution of American radio. Communication procedures in Italy also included the development of more sophisticated coordination with other arms. American tank commanders learned to communicate not just with other tanks but with artillery forward observers, air liaison officers, and engineer units. Radio frequencies were allocated and procedures were developed that allowed tanks to request artillery support, call for airstrikes, or coordinate with engineers for obstacle clearance. This multi-dimensional integration of combat power gave American forces capabilities that were unmatched by any other army in the war. The Germans had developed their own combined arms tactics and were in many ways the pioneers of modern combined arms warfare, but their systems remained fundamentally hierarchical. Requests for support moved up the chain of command to the appropriate headquarters, which would then direct the requested support. The American system, by contrast, created lateral communication links that allowed tanks to coordinate directly with supporting arms, dramatically reducing the time required to bring different types of combat power to bear on a target. By the spring of 1944, as American forces were finally breaking through the Gustav Line and advancing toward Rome, American tank doctrine had evolved far beyond what had existed at the beginning of the war. The tank was no longer seen as just a weapons platform, but as a node in a communication network that connected the entire battlefield. Tank commanders were not just vehicle. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, they expected open country suitable for the rapid armored maneuvers they had perfected in North Africa and Sicily. Instead, they found themselves trapped in the Buca, a centuries-old patchwork of small fields separated by earthen embankments topped with dense, tangled hedges. These hedgerows were effectively natural fortifications, impervious to visual observation and resistant to tank fire. It was a defender's paradise, and the Germans utilized it with ruthless efficiency. German Panthers and anti-tank guns would lie in wait behind the thick vegetation, invisible until they opened fire, turning each small field into a deadly claustrophobic arena. In this environment, the range advantage of tank guns was nullified, and the battle devolved into a series of vicious, close-range ambushes. Initially, American armor suffered catastrophic losses. A single German tank, hidden in the shadows of a hedgerow, could hold up an entire American advance for hours. However, this topographical nightmare became the proving ground for the ultimate test of the American radio network. With visibility often reduced to less than 50 yards, the invisible web of communication became the only way to see the battlefield. American tank commanders realized that while they couldn't physically see through the hedges, they could build a mental map of the enemy using their radios. If a tank on the far left of a field received fire, the commander would instantly broadcast the vector. Within seconds, tanks on the right, which had no line of sight to the enemy, would know exactly where the threat lay. They developed a tactic known as reconnaissance by radio. Instead of exposing the entire platoon to find a hidden German gun, a single scout car or infantry team would move forward. The moment they drew fire, they would relay the coordinates to the tank platoon waiting behind the hedgerow. The tanks, using the shared radio data, would then saturate the specific area of the hedgerow with high explosive shells and machine gun fire before poking their noses out. It was a form of blind firing that relied entirely on trust in the communication network. The Germans, accustomed to visual target acquisition, were baffled by the volume and accuracy of American fire, directed at positions that should have been invisible to the tanks engaging them. Furthermore, the integration of air support reached new heights in the bocage. American tanks were equipped with radios that could, through a liaison officer, talk to circling fighter bombers. When a German Tiger tank or a stubborn pillbox blocked the advance, a tank commander could effectively call down a thunderbolt from the sky. The Germans had no counter to this. Their own tanks, superior in armor and armament, were often isolated due to the terrain. A German Panther commander in the bocage was the lord of his own field, but he was deaf and blind to what was happening. 2 fields over, the American Sherman commander, conversely, was part of a hive mind. When American engineers developed the Kulin Rhino, a steel prong device welded to the front of tanks to cut through the hedges, the breakthrough wasn't just mechanical, it was tactical. The radios allowed multiple tanks to breach a hedgerow simultaneously at different points, overwhelming the German defenders who could not pivot their guns fast enough to address threats appearing from 3 or 4 directions at once. By late July, as Operation Cobra's the breakout from Normandy commenced, the American radio doctrine had matured into a lethal art form. The Germans were still fighting a series of disconnected skirmishes, while the Americans were fighting a unified battle. The frustration among German prisoners was palpable. They felt they were fighting an enemy that cheated, an enemy that knew their positions before the battle even began. They didn't realize that their own firing positions were being triangulated and shared across a network of hundreds of American listeners the moment they fired a single shot. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Once the Allied forces broke free of the Normandy hedgerows, the nature of the war shifted dramatically. General George Patton's Third Army began a dash across France that would become legendary for its speed and aggression. This was the Great Swan, a period of rapid movement where the front lines dissolved into fluidity. For the German High Command, this phase of the war was a nightmare of confusion. Their doctrine relied on establishing defensive lines, but American forces were moving so fast that by the time German orders were issued to defend a river or a town, American tanks were already 10 miles past it. The secret engine of this speed was, once again, the radio dot in traditional warfare. A rapid advance stretches the lines of communication until they snap. Orders from headquarters take too long to reach the spearhead, and reports from the front take too long to reach headquarters. But the American armored divisions carried their command structure with them over the airwaves. Division commanders could speak directly to battalion commanders on the move. There was no need to stop and set up telegraph wires or wait for motorcycle couriers. This allowed American columns to bypass strong points rather than getting bogged down. If the lead tank battalion encountered heavy resistance at a town, their commander would radio the situation to the units following. Without pausing, the rest of the column would peel off, loop around the town, and cut off the German defenders from the rear, leaving the strong point isolated to be dealt with by infantry later. The Germans, whose radios were still largely confined to a rigid hierarchy, could not react to this tempo. Their decision-making cycle, the time it took to observe, report, decide, and act, was simply slower than the American movement speed. German units would set up an ambush on a main road, only to watch helplessly as American armored columns, coordinated via radio, to stream across open fields and secondary tracks, bypassing the kill zone entirely. The Americans were operating inside the German OODA loop, acting faster than the enemy could think. A striking example occurred near the town of Chartres. A German Panzer division was attempting to regroup to strike the flank of the American advance. It was a dangerous maneuver that could have cut off Patton's spear. However, scattered American reconnaissance units and light tanks, operating miles apart, began spotting dust clouds and engine noise. Individually, these reports were minor, but because they were all fed into the same radio network, intelligence officers in mobile command posts could instantly piece together the puzzle. They realized a counterattack was forming. Within minutes, orders were flashed to American tank destroyer battalions to redeploy. The German Panzers, expecting to catch the Americans unaware, instead rolled directly into a prepared kill box of American destroyers and artillery that had been vectored in just moments. Before the German commanders were stunned. They had moved under radio silence at night, and yet the Americans seemed to be waiting for them. The psychological impact was devastating. German troops began to feel that the Americans had spies everywhere, or that their own encryption was broken. They failed to grasp that the spies were simply hundreds of American tank crews constantly talking to each other, turning thousands of pairs of eyes into a single, all-seeing surveillance system. The radio had turned the chaotic dash across France into a choreographed ballet of violence, where the chaos was felt only by the enemy. As 1944 drew to a close, the Allied advance stalled against the German border. The weather turned bitter, grounding the Allied Air Force, and Hitler launched his last great gamble, the Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack was designed to exploit the very thing the Americans relied on: organization. By striking with overwhelming force in a quiet sector, the Germans hoped to shatter the American command structure and cause a panic that would lead to a rout. For the first few days, it seemed to work. American lines were overrun, units were scattered, and chaos reigned. However, it was in this chaos that the decentralized nature of the American radio network proved its true resilience. In a top-down rigid system, like the German or Soviet armies, if the headquarters is destroyed or cut off, the subordinate units effectively become paralyzed. But the American system was built on lateral communication. When American tank platoons found themselves cut off from their headquarters, they didn't freeze. They switched frequencies and started looking for anyone else on the air. Remnant groups of tanks, infantry, and engineers, often from different divisions, used their radios to form ad hoc battle groups known as task forces. The defense of Bastogne is the most famous example, but similar dramas played out in 100 nameless villages. Small groups of American Sherman tanks, isolated in the snow, used their radios to coordinate crossfire traps for advancing German columns. A platoon of Shermans might be hiding in a tree line, hopelessly outgunned by advancing King Tigers. Instead of fleeing, they would use their radios to coordinate a swarm. One tank would expose itself to draw the Tiger's attention, broadcasting bait out to his comrades. As the Tiger's slow turret turned to face the distraction, the other American tanks, listening on the net, would know the exact moment to break cover and fire into the Tiger's thinner side armor. The Germans found that even when they surrounded American units, the encircled forces fought with a coordination that shouldn't have been possible. The radio waves were thick with American voices sharing target data, encouragement, and warnings. Your German jamming attempts were only partially effective because the American network was so distributed. If one frequency was jammed, the crews simply hopped to another agreed-upon channel. This electronic resilience bought time. It slowed the German advance just enough for the weather to clear and for reinforcements to arrive. One captured German major, after surrendering near St. Vith, expressed his exasperation to his captors. He explained that in the German army, that unit cut off from its leadership was considered effectively neutralized. But the Americans, he complained, seemed to fight even harder when cut off, acting like a bag of marbles that becomes a bag of diamonds under pressure. He didn't understand that the radio allowed every junior officer to become a general of his own small battlefield, making decisions based on real-time data rather than waiting for orders that would never come. The Battle of the Bulge was not won by superior tanks. It was won by superior connectivity. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. *Bailey, 1945. The war had moved into the heart of Germany. The terrain shifted once again, this time to the industrial ruins of the Ruhr and the dense urban sprawl of German cities. Urban warfare is the most difficult type of combat for tanks. High buildings block line of sight. Rubble piles restrict movement, and enemies can attack from above, below, and any side. In this three-dimensional hell, the radio network became a lifeline. The Americans developed techniques for tank infantry, teams that operated with telepathic closeness. The external infantry phones on the back of Sherman tanks were hardwired into the tank's intercom, but the radio remained the primary link between different tank teams sweeping parallel streets. As American columns pushed into cities like Cologne and Magdeburg, the tanks operated in pairs. One tank would watch the street level, while the second tank, guided by radio reports from infantry in the buildings above, would scan the upper stories for Panzerfaust teams. The moment a sniper or anti-tank gun was spotted, the information was flashed across the network. A tank 2 streets over might be asked to fire a shell through a specific building, to suppress a target that the requesting tank couldn't reach. This direct fire was terrifying to the defenders. German troops felt there was no cover safe from American firepower. The disintegration of the German army in these final months highlighted the stark contrast between the two systems. As the German command infrastructure collapsed under relentless bombing and rapid Allied advances, German tanks were often fighting completely blind. They had no fuel, no recon, and no idea where the enemy was until they were being fired upon. In contrast, the American logistical system, driven by radio requests, ensured that fuel and ammunition trucks knew exactly where to go. A tank platoon, running low on shells, could radio a supply convoy, vector them in through a secure route, and be rearmed in 20 minutes. The final battles also saw the American use of radios to negotiate surrenders. American tanks, equipped with loudspeakers and supported by radio-connected psychological warfare units, would broadcast demands to surrounded German garrisons. But more subtly, American commanders would sometimes broadcast on German frequencies, giving false orders or simply announcing the hopelessness of the situation. The electronic dominance was total. In one engagement near the Elbe River, a group of frantic young German soldiers manned a roadblock with a formidable 88mm gun. They waited for the American tanks to appear around the bend. Instead, they were hit by a precise mortar barrage, followed by smoke shells, and then flanked by infantry who had moved through the woods. The American tanks rolled past the disabled gun without firing a shot. The tank commander had received a warning from a spotter plane pilot, who had seen the glint of the gun barrel from the air and radioed the warning directly to the tank column. The German ambush was defeated by a voice from the sky, relayed to a metal box on the ground. The war ended, not with a bang, but with a static hiss as the German networks went silent, while the American airwaves were alive with the business of victory. When the smoke cleared in May 1945, military analysts began the long process of dissecting the conflict. For decades, popular history would focus on the machines, the terrifying Tiger, the sleek Panther, and the mass-produced Sherman. The narrative was often simple: the Americans won through sheer industrial quantity, overwhelming superior German engineering with numbers. While there is truth to the industrial advantage, this analysis misses the crucial force multiplier that made those numbers effective. The secret weapon wasn't the tank itself, it was the radio inside it. Post-war interrogations of high-ranking German generals, including Guderian and von Manteuffel, revealed a begrudging respect, not for American tank armor, which they considered weak, but for American tactical flexibility. They were repeatedly astounded by the speed of American reaction times. They couldn't comprehend how a breakthrough in one sector was exploited so instantly, or how a defensive gap was plugged before they could move through it. They had spent the war looking for a centralized brain controlling the American beast, never realizing that the American beast had a brain in every cell. The legacy of the US tank radio network went far beyond World War II. It laid the foundational doctrine for the modern concept of network-centric warfare. The crude vacuum tube radios of 1944 were the ancestors of the digital data links, satellite comms, and battlefield internet used by modern armies today. The American philosophized that information should flow laterally to the lowest level. Empowering junior leaders to make decisions became the gold standard for NATO and the Western world. The United States Army had proven that in the chaos of war, the soldier who knows what is happening is infinitely more dangerous than the soldier who is merely following orders. The Sherman tank, often maligned for its thin armor and smaller gun, was actually the most advanced weapon system of the war, not because of its steel, but because of its connectivity. It was the first true platform of the information age. Looking back, the forests of Europe witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare. The German troops saw metal monsters coming through the mist, but what defeated them was the invisible, chatter-filled web that connected those monsters. It was a victory of software over hardware, of communication over isolation, and of shared knowledge over secret plans. The secret that changed the war was simply the ability to talk, to listen, and to act as one. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more untold histories of military technology, please leave your like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.